In case you missed it, here's a Sports Animal Rewind.
Sports Page Summer College Football, taking a look in depth at the Tennessee Volunteers throughout the show today, and joining us, friend of the show, face to face today, Ryan Callahan from GoVols 24/7. How you doing, Ryan?
Doing well. How are you guys?
We're good. So why don't we just jump right into our conversation here? We're going to leave you alone from a recruiting standpoint today, but jump into our receivers. We're trying to figure out sort of a verbal depth chart for the receivers. If you had to put down three receivers as ones, which would be the three you would go with?
I'm a lot like Evan on this one. I can't pencil in Marquez North just yet. I think he's a guy to obviously keep an eye on in camp, and I think he still has a chance to maybe start the opener. But the only thing we don't know is just how desperately the staff is going to want to force those talented receivers in there without probably having a good understanding of the system and the playbook and those kinds of things. You can get freshmen on the field if you really want them there. You just have to kind of limit yourself in some ways or put them in favorable situations as much as you can. So right now I would lean toward Jason Kroom. I would also lean maybe toward Cody Blank based on what we saw this spring. I think he's got enough of a run blocking ability and playmaking ability. I think he's maybe one of the better combinations there. And then in the slot, it's so close between Pig Howard and Devin Young. I don't know which one I could pick there, but I would probably lean toward Devin Young, maybe just because of his experience. I think they're both going to play an awful lot, so I'm not sure it matters who is necessarily the starter. But I'll say for now Devin Young. But I think he was struggling enough with that transition this spring that it wouldn't surprise me if Pig Howard is the guy to start preseason camp.
All right, so it sounds like you guys both think Kroom will be one starting receiver, Devin Young will be the slot, and then I think everyone's on a different spot for that second outside receiver, right? You think, Evan, maybe Jacob Carter.
Well, I listed Carter or Blank as possibilities, and then a freshman as a wild card. But Blank is reasonable because Carter was hurt for part of the spring. I thought he had a decent spring. I thought Blank had a decent spring. I could see any of those guys. I think that'll be up in the air.
Vincent Dallas would maybe have a shot. I think Vincent's maybe a little bit short on the playmaking ability you would want from a starter. I think he's a solid run blocker and those kinds of things you look for in a starter. That's what I look for in picking a starting receiver, and that's the only reason I didn't pick Jacob Carter is I think he's a little lacking in the run blocking department, and I think that's something coaches usually pay attention to quite a bit. I don't know for sure about this staff how much they will value that, but we've seen that here in the past at Tennessee. So I think right now I would lean toward Blank or someone like that, but can't rule out Vincent Dallas. I mean, I was telling someone just the other day, I haven't seen a position on the depth chart anywhere really that I can remember that was as wide open as wide receiver is going into preseason camp at Tennessee in several years. It's kind of impressive just how many names legitimately could have a chance to start at some point this year.
And this is wide receiver you, as fans know, and so I think that makes it even more strange that you have the situation.
No doubt. And one name we haven't mentioned yet that I think maybe fans will have to familiarize themselves with a bit. We don't know for sure if he'll have a chance to make an impact, but Jonathan Johnson, a late junior college addition that could play in the slot some. If we saw Devin Young struggle at times this spring, we saw Pig Howard, not struggle, but we saw. I mean, those guys both were having to learn a lot this spring. Yeah, they had some moments where they were not just taking that position by the horns. So I wouldn't be surprised to see Johnson play a factor there as well. And I think Ryan Jenkins, the freshman, may have a chance. So we'll see. There's a lot of guys to keep an eye on this during fall camp.
Vince, two names we didn't mention, and there was a reason we didn't mention them. I thought Dre Bowles had kind of a golden opportunity missed this spring as far as, this was a spring to emerge, and I didn't think he had a particularly good one from what I saw. And then, God bless him, but Paul Harris, I mean, he was a freshman and he was brand new and he will get better and there will be more chances for him, but he had a bit of a rough spring as well. And I don't think based on what we saw, you could really, I don't think I could put him ahead of the incoming freshman right now based on what we saw until I saw some more of them.
Well, and then the other new guys, you mentioned North coming in. Ryan, you mentioned Jenkins and Jonathan Johnson. Then there's Josh Smith as well. he certainly has the capabilities to make some plays. The other guys on the roster, Dylan West, Brett Parisi, and Tyler Drummer that are listed at wide receiver. So as far as our ones, it sounds like it would be Devin Young, Cody Blank, Jason Kroom, with Kroom being at the top, and then a whole host of guys at number 2. Seriously, that is an extremely wide open position. I'm Vince Ferrara along with Evan Woodbery, Ryan Callahan, GoVols247.com, joining our discussion. You can follow him on Twitter. It's at Ryan Callahan 247. Quickly on the tight ends, Evan, where would you go in terms of a starting tight end? Would it be Downs at the top?
Yeah, I think so. Really there aren't a whole lot of other options as far as guys who have experience. There's Justin Meredith, but he's, been hurt almost from the day he arrived and hasn't, gone through a lot of practices, let alone a lot of games. So I think it's Brendan Downs and then some walk-ons or former walk-ons who maybe are not pass catchers, but maybe could help out in blocking situations. And then, you've got the newcomers after that. And, we talked about Woody Quinn earlier in the show. He's a JUCO guy, athletic, tall, big, unusual background as a volleyball player going back to football. But I think everyone's excited to see what he can do. And, he'll have a chance to play immediately, I think, just by default, just because there aren't a whole lot of other options there. And the other newcomer, A.J. Branisell, could play too, but I think he's going to be more of a work in progress just as far as having to add some weight and add some size and that sort of thing, whereas Woody Quinn is more game ready at this point.
Quick thoughts on the tight end position, and how would you maybe rank them on a depth chart?
Yeah, I think going into the year, I would agree with Evan. I think it's Downs probably at the top until further notice. It would take quite a showing by Woody Quinn this year to beat him out. I don't see Branisell being a big factor this year, but you never know how injuries might play a part in that. Like you said, Justin Meredith, we'll just wait and see if he can get healthy. If he ever can get healthy, I think he's a guy capable of contributing, but he just hasn't been healthy since he arrived on campus. But Woody Quinn is really the big variable in this whole equation, because we don't know how much he's going to be able to play, but I think Tennessee wants him to play right away. Obviously, they brought him in from junior college with only 2 years to play too, so he doesn't have a red shirt left. He has 2 years to do whatever he can do, and I think they brought him in thinking he can make an immediate impact, and that's despite the fact that he's coming off shoulder surgery back in January, much like Jalen Reeves-Maben, who sat out this spring. So I think he'll most likely be ready physically, just a matter of how quickly. It's a complicated position, as we well know, how quickly he can learn things there. And one underrated aspect of this, I think people maybe hear spread offense and that kind of thing with Butch Jones and a lot of offenses these days. They don't think about tight ends a lot, but Butch Jones's offense really incorporates a lot of 2 tight end sets if they can. And with Woody Quinn, I think they at least feel like they had that option.
Well, it's a great point, Ryan, because Evan, I want to get your thoughts on this. If they see a little more ability immediately at the tight end position, why not go to 2 tights and then 2 receivers as opposed to 3?
Well, and not to turn into recruiting too much, but this is one of the reasons you see Tennessee with 2 tight end commitments in this class, because they do like to run a lot of multiple tight end sets. And I think this year with Brendan Downs and Woody Quinn, that's, like you said, with the receivers not being all that proven, that's one way they could make up for that, is by having those 2 guys on the field if they're good.
Well, and it's also worth noting that Woody Quinn and Branisell were guys that these are Butch guys. These were not Dooley guys that he inherited. These were guys that he recruited and added to the class in the frantic month or 2 since he came on board. So I think that's an indication he really likes having tight ends, and that's why I think it's important that Woody Quinn be ready to go, because if he's not an option, all you really have is Downs, and it's tough to run, I think, what they would like to run with just one reliable, proven tight end.
Thinking about it, couple things off of what you guys are talking about. They could go 2 tights, but split one out. Mm-hmm. If you are deficient and you are lacking at that wide receiver position, you put some tight ends and you split them out if you think you can get a matchup. That helps you at one spot there. And then because if you need to do that, I think we may see, especially in short yardage, something that we've seen a little bit in the past. We saw it in Tiny Richardson's rookie year. you put a sixth offensive lineman in, and they act, Alex Bullard last year, and they act as your tight end. Therefore, you can do more passing game type stuff with the tight ends.
Yeah, I think you will see this staff flex out the tight ends a good bit. That's one of the reasons we've seen from their commitments. They do like some guys with the versatility to do that, and we've seen some guys who are tight ends. Daniel Helm, that's an incoming commitment, basically a wide receiver in high school that they feel like can grow into a tight end, and only 220 pounds. So Woody Quinn, super athletic tight end. He's much bigger than that, about 255, but he's a guy you could do that with. A.J. Branisel, if he's going to make an immediate impact, maybe could be in that type of role. So I think you could see some tight ends in the slot and more involved in the passing game than people might think.
And you have the offensive lineman to do that as well, because that's a great position for you. You have 6 very strong offensive linemen. If you have one that's on your bench and you're struggling to start guys and get guys a lot of snaps at other positions, why not utilize that, Evan? What do you think?
I think that would be that'll be a great angle to pursue. Because I don't know that we've specifically asked him about that.
Well, I heard it asked this spring, and I think they actually initially shot that down a little bit. I think Mark Elder, the tight ends coach, was the one who was asked about it and said, I don't know if you'll see any 88s that are offensive linemen, like Alex Bullard was this past year, but you never know.
Part of that, it's sort of like AJ Johnson and the Wildcat. I mean, they're trying to work on the simple stuff now, and
right,
they'll add layers as they go along. That's Ryan Callahan, along with Evan Woodbery here on the News Sentinel sports page. You got an awful lot to get to. While we're on the offensive line, we know how good this group is, so we won't spend a ton of time on it. Let's specifically, obviously, we know who the starters are going to be, but hit on that, on the battle, the position battle there. It looks like at guard, even though they had a lot of guys sort of cross-training.
Yeah, no doubt. They tried to work some guys at different positions later in the spring, but I think it's going to be at left guard between Alex Bullard and Marcus Jackson. It looked like for most of the spring, Evan, it seemed like Alex Bullard maybe had the edge for a lot of the spring, but I wouldn't rule out Marcus Jackson there, but Bullard certainly has the experience. He's the senior, and it makes a pretty nice sales pitch also for recruiting purposes that I know the staff thinks recruiting all the time, to have basically 5 seniors on the way out with that offensive line, counting Tiny Richardson essentially as a senior because they think he's going to the NFL draft. It's a nice sales pitch to be able to say this entire offensive line may go to the NFL. So I don't know that that's a big factor, but Bullard seemed to have the edge. I would give him the slight upper hand, but wouldn't surprise me if either of those guys are in the job.
Yeah, and I would pencil in Bullard right now just based on the depth chart we saw most often in the spring. But they feel really good about Marcus Jackson for obvious reasons, and it's always helpful to have a 6th man of sorts on the offensive line. And one of the reasons for the cross training that they did was that if there were an injury and someone was to go down, that you can kind of shuffle things and just insert the next best lineman, which in this case would be Marcus Jackson, and then kind of shuffle the rest of the line accordingly. And, there are pros and cons to that. Sometimes you don't want to change everybody's position. Sometimes you just want to change one. But I don't think there's any doubt that the next best lineman in would probably be Marcus Jackson in that situation. And, that's a luxury that not every team has, to have 5 starters that you feel good about and at least one veteran, experienced backup able to come off the bench in various situations.
Are there any other offensive linemen that they feel good about putting in the game? I mean, who else can we put in it too that they might feel good about?
I feel like both Matt Crowder and Kyler Kerberson's stock rose during this spring. I think, and part of that was I think they got a lot of good coaching time because, to a certain extent, the first team was so settled that Mahoney could kind of say, okay, now I'm going to work a lot with the young guys. Marcus Pear had his moments, and, obviously for a guy who hasn't done a whole lot during his career, just to have a few moments with that first team was good. I feel like he's probably still maybe a rung below Crowder or Kerberson, but I feel like they, and Ryan, you can probably reflect on this as well, but I feel like they left spring maybe feeling a little bit better about that second group of guys than they entered spring feeling about it.
Yeah, I think so. The one that stood out to me as having a pretty good spring was Matt Crowder. We heard his name quite a bit as having made some progress, and I think he's a guy who could certainly help at center there if they were in a bind. And let's remember James Stone, the starting center, is a guy that has some versatility. Has played guard in the past, briefly played tackle, I think, as a true freshman. So that they have some versatility with him. If they got in a bind, I could see them maybe throwing Crowder in there and moving around Stone some if they had to. So that gives them some options. Beyond those 8, I don't know that there's a whole lot that they feel good about, but I think there's a chance for those freshmen, Austin Sanders, Brett Kendrick, Dylan Wiseman, maybe to make an impact there, especially Brett Kendrick maybe at left tackle, maybe having a chance to come in and be the number 2 left tackle. We'll see about that. But again, I think the next guys in the game would likely be Jackson, Crowder, and most likely Kirbyson.
And the tough part, Vince, is that offensive line is a developmental position more than any other spot, and you see the roster, and they've got a ton of guys that have been here 3 and 4 years, and very few guys that have been here, they've got those 3 newcomers, and that's about it. And so there's going to be a gap after this next senior class leaves, and there's not, you would rather have some more young guys that are kind of developing right now than they have. The numbers aren't as high from just a strictly body standpoint, and it's not balanced, I think, as well as you would like either. And that's a deficiency mainly, I guess, in the class of 2012 when they weren't able to corral any of the linemen that they wanted.
Well, and you wonder if they're going to have this sort of exodus in the offensive line. If they try to sprinkle guys in and have a little bit more of a rotation, get some of these guys at least some snaps, so it's not completely a brand new offensive line, especially because you're not very deep.
Exactly.
Next year.
No, I think there's no matter how well you recruit in this class, you're going to have some guys that are on campus right now start on the offensive line next year. There's no way at least 2 or 3 are not starting next year. So you make a good point. I think those guys have to play some. I think they will do what they can to get those guys in the game, but they also know, as we've gone through other positions, I know you guys have talked about it a little bit earlier as well. The offensive line is the star of this team going into the season. If this team has a chance to overachieve, it's because of the offensive line, so they're also not going to take those better players off the field very much.
Ryan Callahan from GoVols 24/7 joining Evan Woodbery at Tennessee Beat on Twitter, and myself, Vince Ferrara, here on the New Sentinel Sports page. We'll go defense the rest of the way. Guys, we'll start on the defensive line, and I don't know how easy this is going to be to try to find some 1s and some 2s out of this group, because there's a lot of experience. Evan, you've pointed out a number of guys with double-digit games played, with starts. This is an experienced group. How would you line them up along the front?
Yeah, and I've been on the record as saying I think the defensive line is maybe better than people give it credit for, or at least has the potential to be better than people give it credit for. That, maybe there's not the star power that you would like, but there's a lot of very serviceable veteran experienced players. It's going to depend how exactly they want to do it. Obviously, you'll have Daniel McCullers is one of the inside guys there. The other one is tricky because Mo Couch didn't play at all in the spring, and this coaching staff hasn't really gotten a chance to look at him. I kind of like Dan Hood as a wild card there, just because the staff has got to see him. He had a nice spring. He's a veteran. He's experienced. He'll play a lot regardless, but I think he might be an interesting guy just to pencil in there as an inside guy, for the purposes of this exercise. And then on the outside, Jaquez Smith to me stands as one of those guys who has maybe elite ability or is a guy that has a chance to take that next step and be a better player than he's been during his Tennessee career. He's an athlete. He's played a lot. He's just never been a star, perhaps, and I like him. And I've got one last one to go. That's another tricky one. I mean, I guess Marlon Walls might be an option. Jordan Williams might be an option. Am I forgetting anybody, Ryan? I mean, those are other options on the end. Corey Miller would be an option. Yeah. They really have a lot. I mean, you could legitimately come up with a good 8-man rotation in that defensive front, and all 8 guys have played quite a bit and are going to be fairly experienced. So, I mean, they've got some options there.
Ryan, what do you think about the D-line, and where would you go in terms of starters right now?
Yeah, I would pretty much agree with Evan. Like he said, I think the other defensive tackle spot is interesting, not just because of Mo Couch and not knowing whether he can overtake Daniel Hood for that other spot next to Daniel McCullers, but because let's not forget McCullers was actually playing the 3 technique position, which you think of as more of a position for a smaller, more athletic defensive tackle. He's a big guy, but they want to put him in a playmaking position. So that the other guy they want is a nose tackle, and that may lend itself to Hood being the choice actually, because he is a little more of a natural nose tackle despite not having a naturally huge body. He just kind of fits that role well, and even did in the 3-4. So I could see him starting actually over Mo Couch, but either way, Couch is going to play a lot. I would lean toward Couch just based on his role last year, but he does have to prove himself to the new staff. I do think Marlon Walls maybe has the upper hand on that defensive end spot opposite Jacquez Smith or whoever you want to pencil in there. They do need a more proven pass rusher than they have at that one defensive end spot. You know, it's the Leo position or whatever you want to call it, the pass rushing role. And they really don't. That's the one spot where there's a chance for some guys to come in and help, because I don't think Jacquez Smith has proven quite enough in the past to where you feel great about that spot. But the other 3 spots, really, I think they're in okay shape there. And I think between Marlon Walls and Corey Miller, they've got decent depth at defensive end too. But there's still a chance for Jason Carr, some of those freshmen, to come in and compete and at least have a chance to be in the rotation as well.
All right, let's talk about these guys. So you have just to split them up between the tackles and the ends. Your ends are Jacquez Smith, Corey Miller, Marlon Walls, Jordan Williams, LaTroy Lewis, Corey Vereen, Jason Carr, Jalen Miller, Malik Brown. Out of the newcomers, who would you give the best shot at maybe making an impact?
It's tough to say. Jalen Miller is a guy that put up great numbers in high school. He's an interesting to watch this fall because he was playing a little heavier his last year in high school, and he's actually dropped some weight before getting to Tennessee, and is back down in more of a defensive end type weight, you know, in the 240 to 250 range, whereas before he was maybe in that 260 range and maybe was lending himself to maybe being a defensive tackle down the road. Now that's not so certain. So I think he and Brown both have a good chance to play. They're both good pass rushers, I think, that can help. And they probably need more help at defensive end than defensive tackle. So in some ways, although Jason Carr is the best of those freshmen, I think he's maybe not as likely to play in some ways right away, at least a lot, as Malik Brown and Jalen Miller. So those guys both have a chance. Hard for me to say one has a better chance than the others.
And Evan, you talked about the tackles too with Hood and Couch and McCullers, Alan Carson, Travaris Salisbury, Gregory Clark, and then Danny O'Brien too, who's pretty highly recruited guy. There's some other guys that maybe we haven't seen fully develop also.
Yeah, it's funny. And you mentioned those 4 all together, and those are 4 guys, really none of whom have fully reached their expectations. I would probably say of that group, maybe Salisbury. I think the jury is still out, and he still has a chance to have an impact of sorts. But Alan Carson and Gregory Clark have, I think, probably largely been passed over in the pecking order by younger guys coming in after him, and that's never where you want to be as a veteran, particularly as a veteran lineman. And then Danny O'Brien. I mean, he's a
4-star.
He was a 4-star, yeah. Mm-hmm. And has obviously we haven't seen him in games, but based on where we've seen him land in the depth charts and what we've seen in practice of where he's playing, he has not lived up to the expectations to a certain extent, and is also another guy that's in danger of getting passed over by younger players coming in after him.
All right, so let's pick this out. Get some 1s and some 2s at least. Are the ones that we agree on? Is it McCullers and Hood at the tackle spots, Jacquez Smith at one end, and then we need a second end? Who would be the other end? How would you do the starters, Ryan?
I would have Jacquez Smith and Marlon Walls at the end spots. I wouldn't rule out Corey Miller at all, but I think Walls maybe, based on what we saw this spring, was out there a little more with the starters for most of the spring. Even though he's a bigger end, I think it worked from what we saw this spring. And then at the tackles, I would lean toward maybe Couch over Hood just based on what we've seen in the past. But again, like Evan said, Hood definitely has a chance to be out there. And again, because it's the nose tackle position, Hood may be a more natural fit, but I'll go with Couch just because he's been a little more productive in the past.
And who's your other end? Who do you think?
Walls and Jacquez Smith would I think be the other one to start off.
Okay, so Walls would be the other one.
Mm-hmm.
And then in terms of 2, I guess you would put maybe Miller, and then your other tackles, your 2 tackle would be either Hood or Couch. And then who would be the second defensive end? Would you put a freshman at another backup defensive end spot?
I think that second one maybe between Jordan Williams and LaTroy Lewis, someone like that. I think one of those two guys is probably capable of doing that. Let's not forget Corey Vereen. I mean, I think a lot of people maybe got a little excited about his spring and maybe expecting a bit much from him, but he's a guy who I think can contribute based on what we saw this spring, at least in some capacity.
I will say for Corey Vereen, and to a certain extent, especially the more technical positions like the lines, you have to kind of just listen to what the coaches say. And I don't know that I've had in my entire career heard a coach that praised a freshman more than Steve Stripling praised Corey Vereen. Now that may not mean anything for this first year, but I think for his long-term future, definitely bodes quite well.
I would put him at one of the backups. I think we're going to see him, and we're going to see him in that rotation. And I think his play is going to warrant him staying in there.
He was, I mean, let's face it, they need pass rushers, and he proved this spring he's a guy that can do that. And this is a guy that was expected to come in under the old staff as a 3-4 outside linebacker, and he's fit naturally in that 4-3 end spot. And I think he's shown he at least can help in some way, shape, or form. Now again, I'd like to see a little more of LaTroy Lewis this spring. What we saw, I didn't feel like he was quite back to normal yet, getting back on the field. I'd like to see if he's better this fall during camp before I rule out him as more of a factor. I think he has a chance to at least contribute there.
Ryan Callahan from GoVols 24/7 joining Evan Woodbery and I here for our Tennessee football preview as we do the Sports Page Summer of College Football, focusing on the Tennessee Volunteers today. Let's hit on the final two positions or the areas on defense. We'll start with the linebackers. Pretty much know who the starters are. Evan, we'll go A.J. Johnson, Kurt Maggitt, and Dante Vassap in that base 4-3.
Yeah, I think so, and I think if there were any doubts about the ability of Sapp to step up from basically a career reserve to starting his final senior year, it was alleviated. We talked about Corey Vereen being praised. Dante Vassap would come in number 2 for just over-the-top gushing praise from coaches this spring, including from the head man, Butch Jones. They felt like he had a really terrific spring and did everything right to earn that position. So I think those are some safe bets, and they've got some depth there as well, some veteran depth, and it's another position where they need to get some bodies and maybe even some JUCO bodies, because after this year there's going to be a big gap in the kind of the class balance at that position.
Ryan, what do you think? Those are the ones, right? And then who would be your twos across the line?
I think those are the ones. The only one who might have a say in that at all would be Brent Brewer, and I don't see him unseating Dante Vassap this fall, but we'll see. I do think Brewer will play a good bit. I don't know about a lot, but he'll play in some different packages, certainly a nickel and dime linebacker at the very least, and so I think you'll see him as one of the twos. It's tough to say on those other ones. We saw those guys shuffled in and out quite a bit. There's several names to watch there, but I think just off the top of my head, I think maybe someone like a Christian Harris could have a chance to be a 2.
Kenny Bynum
could be a 2. A lot of it will just depend on this fall. I think those are still up for grabs a little bit, but they had a chance to play this spring a little more because of Kurt Maggitt being out, and that helped them kind of get a better pecking order going into the fall.
Maybe Channing Fugit at the 2, at the mic.
Yeah, Fugit was one I was forgetting. Fugit definitely will be, I think, one of the 2s if I had to guess.
All right, let's that's a position with not really the intrigue in what could happen, but when you move over to the DBs, and then you have all kinds of potential movement. There's a lot of bodies out there. We'll start at the corner spots. Eric Gordon, who, Evan, as you pointed out on your blog, he's still listed on the roster, so he may have to do some work to be able to stay on the team. Naz Oliver, Jerron Toney, Justin Coleman, Riyad Jones, Lehman Johnson, Cameron Sutton, and Malik Foreman come in. What do you think of the corners, Ryan? And also tell us about Devon Swafford, where you think he might fit in.
I think Swafford likely starts off as a safety and nickel type guy, and Lehman Johnson's also in that group too. He played at safety all spring, so I think he's a safety to start off. So Tennessee's depth there actually looks pretty good when you throw in Jalen Reeves-Maben and some of those other guys. So they are deep at safety. Corner, not so much, and I think they're going to need. Maybe not both, but in some form or fashion, I think they'll probably need a contribution from Malik Foreman or Cam Sutton at some point. The depth just not where it needs to be. We'll see what Eric Gordon's status is going forward. It looks like he might still have a chance to be with the team, and if that's the case, that's a huge help. But obviously going into the fall, I think the favorites to start there would be Justin Coleman and Riyad Jones based on what we saw this spring.
All right, and who would be the twos in your opinion?
I would go. It's tricky with the nickel position at corner. I think Gordon is the nickel if he's there. Tony would be the other nickel.
Right.
You probably see those two play a lot. The outside corners, that's where who else is on the list. It's tricky. So I think one of the freshmen likely takes at least one of those number 2 spots, and
Naz Oliver,
and maybe Naz Oliver for the second one is what I would say.
That's dicey. Evan, what do you think about the corners, and then how does a safety position in terms of the depth shake out?
No, I think Ryan handled the corners well, and Naz Oliver was another guy, 5th-year senior now. I think he's played exactly one game in his Tennessee career, and there was thought that maybe with Dooley gone that he was out of the doghouse and would have a chance with the new staff, but I don't think there was any indication this spring that would be in the works. At the safety front, you've got Byron Moore, you've got Brian Randolph, you've got Ladero McNeil, who would be kind of that number 3, the next guy in, I think, and will probably play a whole lot. And then, some of the younger guys as well. I think Jalen Reevens-Maven stands out as one of the most intriguing options there, although he was hurt all spring and didn't get to do a whole lot. But he's a guy that's athletic, can play a lot of different positions, but Willie Martinez has said he's going to fight for him to stay as safety for as long as possible at least. And, I have to imagine that he could be a candidate for early playing time, assuming he's healthy and ready to go in the camp.
All right, so that's a look at the DBs and special teams. We know Pilardi's got all those gigs.
He's doing everything.
Right. Yeah, he is doing everything. Let's talk about the schedule. We'll get a final prediction here in the last couple minutes of the show. Here's a Tennessee schedule. It's home to Austin Peay, home to Western Kentucky, at Oregon, at Florida, home to South Alabama, host Georgia, bye week, home to South Carolina, at Alabama, at Missouri, home to Auburn, bye week, host Vanderbilt, at Kentucky. Evan, talk about the schedule, and what is your final record prediction for Tennessee as we sit right here, June 19th?
Well, it's kind of interesting. To me, unless something very surprising happens, Tennessee will enter the month of November 3-5 overall, 0-4 in the SEC, and then having the season basically decided by the final 4 games, beginning November 2nd, which was at Missouri, home for Auburn, home for Vanderbilt, and at Kentucky. So, the month of November will make or break this season. And, all 4 of those games are winnable. All 4 of those games are losable. And, I think it's kind of similar to last year in the sense that, Tennessee had the talent to win some of those late games, or to at least play better in some of those late games than they did, but they'd been just so beaten down by a losing season that they didn't have I don't know if momentum is the word, but they were not in a good position to finish the season strong. And I think that's going to be the key for Butch Jones and his staff, is to keep the heads up through what is going to be a very tough stretch so that they can enter the month of November poised to win some games. And to answer your question, I'm going with 6-6, which would have them winning 3 of those last 4 games, which is a tall order. But I think doable. I think the Auburn victory is the most doable, or Kentucky victory is most doable. Auburn is second most doable. Vandy and at Missouri could be more challenging, but I think they can win one of those 2.
Ryan, what do you think?
I agree with virtually all of what he said, especially I think Tennessee definitely goes 3-5 the first 2 months, barring a major surprise there one way or the other. And that would put them 0-4 in the SEC. We mentioned the tall order of going, at least 3-1 to make a bowl game in November. I think it's a little bit easier with the new coach. We saw this in 2010 with Derek Dooley. They had a similar situation. They were actually 2-6, I believe, going into the final month of the season, had to win out to make a bowl game, and they did. So, and a lot of that had to do with Tyler Bray coming in as a starting quarterback. That's one thing to keep an eye on this year, is how the quarterbacks do. Could we maybe see a similar situation this year with Josh Dobbs or Riley Ferguson coming in later if the quarterbacks, Worley or Peterman struggle? That's something to maybe keep an eye on later in the year. But I think I think that, like Evan said, 6-6 seems realistic for this team. It's going to depend on how they handle November after a tough first 2 months, no doubt. But I think Auburn, again, at home is winnable. I think the season does come down essentially to those 4 games, and really specifically, I think Auburn, Missouri, and Vanderbilt are the main 3. I think they can win at Kentucky this year. Kentucky's recruiting well, but they're not there yet on the roster. It's those other 3 games in November that determine the season. I think they're mostly toss-ups, but I give them the slight edge against Auburn, and I think they can steal at least one of Missouri and Vanderbilt.
Yeah, I agree with that. I have them at 6-6 as well, but I think the optimism is I think right now is only going to ramp up, and I think people are just assuming Missouri, they weren't that good last year, we'll beat them. Auburn, they sucked last year, we're going to beat them. Vanderbilt, we're Tennessee, they're Vanderbilt, we're going to beat them. Those are all swing games.
Right.
Those are not assumed wins.
Absolutely. Let's say this. People I think are downplaying this. 5-7 is a little more realistic for this team than 8-4. Mm-hmm. That's just the way it is.
Oh, absolutely.
That losing season is entirely realistic. So
possibly a lot more realistic.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I think 5 wins in some ways may be the baseline, but I think they can get to 6 just because of the way they approach the season. I think some optimism with the new coaching staff helps.
You don't have to deal with a lame duck coach at
exactly.
the end, too. I mean, that hurt last year.
If they make a quarterback switch going into the game, say at Missouri or home to Auburn, and Josh Dobbs or Riley Ferguson plays really well and leads them to a bowl game, can you imagine the excitement?
It would be interesting. I'm not ruling out Justin Worley. I think he could have a good year, but that's something interesting to keep in mind. It is similar to that 2010 year when Tyler Bray was a true freshman because you have 2 true freshman quarterbacks.